Hello. In this session, we need to test config server and whether our student details are reading Git repository or not. Before that, I would like to say two more dependencies. In student details, we need to add as part of session. I have taken only one microservice, but we can also take many microservices. But as part of learning, one microservice is fine. So here, these dependencies also we need to add. One is a cloud config client and dependency and bootstrap dependency. We need to add these two dependencies. So these are the two dependencies we need to add. So we should not forget. Next one we already seen, application.properties we need to rename as bootstrap.properties. So this is the service name, our student detail service name, student microservice, and this using this it is going to check with discovery like config server. So whether config server is enabled or not. So using the discovery enabled, and this is the spring.cloud config discovery service id using this config server. This config server name is available at config server example project, and that project name is config server. So using this, what it will happen, the linking between the student service and config server will happen, nothing else, no other comments. And the student service is not going to have any other properties, and it is not having any server port, it is not having any db connection, nothing. But it should refer git repositories with the help of config server. That is the architecture. So in git repository we already ensured the file, so git status, and we are on branch. And in earlier session also I have shown you this property file already available. So student microservice, this is externally locally we defined in git. So if we are opening this file, we can see it is running on 8092 and student microservice and other database and the zipkin URL, other details also available, and it is also registered at Eureka server. So now we are good to test the student service and config server. So a Eureka server anyhow it would be used for registration. So it is Eureka discovery server we need to start first, then config server and student details. So since I already started, we can go to Eureka browser, and this is the Eureka client browser, and you can see here two things are there. Config server is registered and student microservice also registered at Eureka. So that no communication will happen. So microservice will connect with the config server, and config server will connect with the Git, and Git will, from the Git it will read DB connection or whatever the connection properties it will read, and it will provide the response. So when we are requesting from the student microservice, config server will take the request, and that request will send to Git, and from the Git it will read, and config server will get the Git response. That Git response will be sending to student microservice. So we will verify whether config server is properly configured or not. How we can check, and how this config server is properly linked with the Git or not. So for that we need to go and see, and config server verification purpose we can use like this config server URL. So this is a local host, or this URL we can use. So go and see, check 888, and this is the details here, and go and use here. This is a git only. So this is a student microservice, and default we have to use default. So see, we got the details and we got the connection, and our config server able to hit our git repository, and git repository is having these are the properties. Just now we have seen the properties, those are the git repository properties. These are the git repository properties. How many are there? 4, 7, 8. So it is also going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These are the properties. So with this test, what we are understanding is config server properly configured, and it is also interacting with the git repository. Now we are good to test our microservices. We can test one microservice, we can test a number of microservices. But for one microservice, I have defined application.properties, rename to bootstrap.properties, and form.xml required dependencies, only two dependencies added. So now I am going to test student details. So student details we can test. So that is the URL we can take. So student details we can test using the 8092. So this one you can pick the URL and go here, and you can use and student, and here one more details we need to take student, a list of students. This URL is the path. So this is the path. So where we are getting the student, inside the student controller we will be having the path. So that path is this one. If you are going to controller, the root path is a student and the child path is list of students, and that method is a get type. So we can refer that one. And this is the root, and list of students is this one. So this one only we are testing. So if we are good, and we will get the response here, desktop and 8092. So this student service also we have registered, and we are going to test. Now we are going to test, so whether we will get the response or not. Here we need to understand, in these properties nothing is defined, only we are requesting the service is going to request config server, and config server will request a git, and from there git will connect with the db and it will provide the details. So here I am going to request. See, I got the response. This is how we got the response. Even though we do not have anything in the bootstrap.properties, only we have only three properties. What we are doing, we are based on these two properties, we are interacting with the config server. Hey config server, can you please provide the student details? So config server will check with the git, and whether all the database everything is properly ensured, then it will be able to serve the request. So that is the reason we are getting the request and response. So this is how we need to test. So once again I would like to summarize. So this is only testing, and testing we need to test Eureka server, and we need to test the student details. For that, in student details we have added two dependencies. Those two dependencies are, one is bootstrap, another one is cloud config client. These two are we need to ensure, and after that we need to start the Eureka server and config server and student details. For testing config server we need to use the default. So since this is a default, we are testing as a default, but in real time environment dev or SIT or UAT and production also we can do it. So since it is a sample example, I have taken it in a local machine, and in real time environment this will become as a student microservice, student microservice dot SIT. So if you can rename like this, and definitely every environment will be having different properties. So we have to define like this, and if it is production, we are going to define like production. So like this, and internal inside the properties we can change whatever we want to add. Each server will be having different database, and different username, different password. So we can change it, and accordingly this would be treated. So this would be common for local, this would be common for SAT, UAT and prod. So whatever the environment. Now if we are changing without stopping the server also, if we are changing the properties, it will still pick, and it will, whenever request comes, that time it will be loaded, and automatically your request and response will be coming. Without stopping the server, we can update the properties, and automatically config server will interact with the git, and it can serve the response. So this is how we need to test config server, and the purpose also fulfilled. So as earlier initial we have told that the basic purpose of the config server is to maintain centralized external properties instead of maintaining multiple properties for different microservices. We will place at one centralized repository. It can be git, or it can be some other version control system, but we can maintain as a centralized environment. There we will place the required properties. It could be dev, SIT, UAT or prod. So that config server will be able to hit git, and git will provide the response. This is how git server is configured. This is how uh, config server would be configured, and microservice would be able to interact with the config server. And upcoming sessions we will see about other topics. Till then, thank you.